The journey west, Clara Whitmore pressed her trembling hands deeper into her woolen gloves, fighting the urge to flee back onto the train that had carried her across half the continent. The November wind cut through Millfield's single platform like a blade carrying the scent of wood smoke and horse leather. Her fingers throbbed beneath the fabric, a constant reminder of the factory machines that had stolen more than just her strength. They'd taken her voice too, grinding it down to whispers and apologies until she'd learned that silence was safer than speech. Through the grimy window of the depot, she caught her reflection, mouse-brown hair pulled severely back, gray dress chosen for its ability to help her disappear, and eyes that darted away from their own gaze. Papa had been right to call her Little Mouse. She'd spent 24 years proving him correct. But today, she would try to be brave. Today, she would meet Thomas Hartwell, the banker who'd answered her carefully worded letter with promises of a comfortable life in exchange for a quiet, obedient wife. She pulled his photograph from her reticule, a stern-faced man with neat whiskers and cold eyes, and whispered a prayer that he would find her adequate. The train's whistle shrieked behind her, and Clara forced her feet toward the depot door. Whatever lay ahead in this Colorado frontier town, it had to be better than what she'd left behind. 3 weeks earlier, the letter had arrived on the worst day of Clara's life, though she hadn't recognized the mercy in its timing then. She'd returned to Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house with her final factory wages, $3.27, for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week of feeding fabric through machines that bit as often as they sewed. Her hands, wrapped in strips of torn petticoat, had finally healed enough to remove the bandages that morning. The scars would never fade. "Letter for you, Clara girl," Mrs. Kowalski had said, her Polish accent softening the harsh consonants. "From out west, looks like." Clara had stared at the envelope, addressed in her own careful script to the Millfield Matrimonial Correspondence Society. She'd written to 17 such agencies in the past month, each letter a small act of desperation wrapped in proper penmanship. Most had never replied. "Dear Miss Whitmore," the response had begun. "Your letter has been forwarded to me by the good people of this organization. I am Thomas Hartwell, president of First Bank of Millfield, Colorado Territory, age 31, of good character and steady income. I am in need of a wife who values respectability and quiet domesticity above frivolous pursuits." The words had blurred as Clara read them, her heart hammering against her ribs. A banker, a respectable man who wanted a quiet wife. She could be quiet, Lord knew she'd had years of practice. She hadn't told him about her hands. 3 days later, she'd used her last $5 for a train ticket west, carrying everything she owned in a battered carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. The journey took 2.5 days with stops in Chicago and Denver, and with each mile that passed beneath the great iron wheels, Clara felt the weight of her old life lifting. Philadelphia meant the tenement fire that took Mama and Papa when she was 19. It meant 5 years at Kowalski's boarding house, working at Fletcher's textile mill, for wages that barely covered her keep. It meant Mrs. Fletcher's son Robert, with his wandering hands and threats that she'd lose her position if she complained. It meant the day she'd finally found courage to push him away, only to have him accidentally guide her hand into the cutting machine. "Clumsy mouse," he'd laughed while she bled onto the factory floor. "Best be more careful." The scars weren't just on her hands. They lived in the catch of her breath when men raised their voices in the way she crossed streets to avoid groups of workers heading home from their shifts, in the certainty that she was damaged goods no decent man would want. But Thomas Hartwell didn't know about Robert Fletcher. He didn't know about the nightmares or the way her hands shook when she tried to write for too long. His letter spoke of respectability and quiet domesticity, things she could provide if only he could overlook her other failings. The train had rocked through the endless prairie, and Clara had practiced conversations in her head. Simple words about housekeeping and cooking, safe topics that wouldn't require her to reveal too much. She'd memorized his requirements: a woman of good moral character, capable of managing a household, preferably with some education, but not so much as to make her disagreeable. She'd taught Sunday school before the fire, surely that would suffice. As the mountains appeared on the horizon like purple promises, Clara had allowed herself to imagine a different life. A small house with curtains she'd sewn herself. A garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. Maybe children someday, if God blessed her with the courage to be the kind of wife who deserved them. The train had pulled into Millfield at 2:30 on a gray November afternoon, belching steam and coal smoke into the thin mountain air. Clara had stepped onto the platform with her carpetbag clutched in both hands, searching the sparse crowd for a man with neat whiskers and a banker's bearing. Miss Clara Whitmore. She'd turned to find him approaching, taller than his photograph suggested, dressed in a wool coat that spoke of prosperity. His eyes, pale blue and assessing, had swept over her from head to toe with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to evaluating assets. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hartwell, I presume." Her voice had emerged as barely more than a whisper, but she'd been proud that it emerged at all. Indeed, he'd removed his hat with mechanical politeness, revealing perfectly oiled hair. "I trust your journey was adequate." "Yes, sir. Thank you for meeting me." His gaze had lingered on her gloved hands, and Clara's heart had skipped. She'd chosen her thickest gloves, dark brown wool that concealed the worst of the damage, but perhaps he'd noticed something amiss in the way she held herself. "Shall we proceed to the hotel? I've arranged for you to take refreshment while we discuss our arrangement." The Millfield Hotel stood 3 stories tall on the town's main street, its painted sign creaking in the mountain wind. Clara had followed Thomas through the lobby, past curious stares from other guests, into a small parlor furnished with horsehair chairs and antimacassars that had seen better days. "Please sit." He gestured to a chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, streaming through lace curtains. Clara had perched on the edge of the seat, her carpetbag at her feet, hands folded carefully in her lap. The parlor smelled of lemon oil and old tobacco, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. Through the window she could see Millfield's main street, a wide dirt thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings that proclaimed their purposes in bold lettering: General Mercantile Blacksmith, Doc Patterson's Surgery. "Now then," Thomas had settled into the chair across from her, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "Your letter indicated you are 24, unmarried, of sound moral character, and possessed of basic domestic skills." "Yes, sir." "Education. I completed 8th grade. I taught Sunday school at St. Mark's Episcopal before—" She'd faltered, unwilling to mention the fire. "Before what?" "Before my circumstances changed." He'd made a small notation in a leather-bound book he'd produced from his coat pocket. "Family. I have none, sir." The words had tasted like ash. "I am quite alone in the world." Another notation. Previous employment. This was the question she'd dreaded. "I worked at Fletcher's textile mill in Philadelphia." The truth, but not all of it. Factory work. His tone had carried the faint distaste of a man who'd never calloused his hands for wages. "I see in your hands—" Clara's blood had turned to ice water. "Sir, you wear gloves indoors on a warm afternoon. Either you suffer from some condition of the circulation or you have something to hide." He'd leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "I am a banker, Miss Whitmore. I have learned to notice discrepancies." For a moment, Clara had considered lying. She could claim poor circulation or excessive sensitivity to cold. But something in his expression told her the truth would surface eventually, and the delay would only make her deception worse. With trembling fingers, she'd pulled off her right glove. The scars were not pretty. 3 parallel lines where the cutting blade had bitten deep, running from her knuckles to her wrist. The skin had healed pale and puckered with an odd smoothness that marked it forever as damaged. Her left hand bore similar marks, though not as severe. Thomas had stared at the damage for a long moment, his face cycling through surprise, distaste, and something that might have been disgust. When he finally looked up, his pale eyes had gone cold as January frost. "How did this occur?" "An accident at the factory, sir. The machinery—" "Were you intoxicated, careless?" The accusations had hit like physical blows. "No, sir. I was— Someone pushed me. I lost my balance and—" "You were fighting, brawling like a common street woman." "No." The word had burst from her lips, louder than intended, causing other hotel guests to glance in their direction. Clara had shrunk back into her chair, her voice dropping to its familiar whisper. "No, sir. I was not fighting. I was defending myself from unwelcome advances." "I see." Thomas had closed his leather book with a sharp snap. "Miss Whitmore, I fear there has been a misunderstanding." Clara's heart had plummeted to somewhere near her shoes. "Sir, I am a respected businessman in this community. My position requires a wife of unblemished reputation and presentable appearance. His gaze had flicked again to her scarred hand. I cannot possibly introduce a woman bearing such evidence of violent altercation to Millfield society. Mr. Hartwell, please, the scars are old. They don't affect my ability to keep house or... Furthermore, he'd continued as if she hadn't spoken. Your demeanor suggests a nervous disposition unsuitable for the demands of a banker's household. I require a wife capable of hosting social functions, conversing with clients, representing my interests in the community. You can barely speak above a whisper. Each word had fallen on Clara's heart like a hammer blow. She'd known, of course, that she was damaged. She'd simply hoped that here in this frontier town, far from everything that had broken her, she might find someone willing to overlook her flaws for the sake of companionship and domestic comfort. I could learn, she'd whispered. I could practice being no. Thomas had stood straightening his coat with sharp, decisive movements. I'm afraid this arrangement will not suit. I wish you well in your future endeavors, Miss Whitmore, but I cannot offer you marriage. He'd left her sitting in the hotel parlor with her scarred hand exposed to the afternoon light, her carpet bag at her feet, and absolutely no idea what came next. The train back to Philadelphia wouldn't depart for 3 days, and she had exactly $4.17 to her name, not nearly enough for lodging meals and a return ticket. As the sun slanted lower through the lace curtains, Clara had slowly pulled her glove back on and tried to think of a single reason not to walk out into the Colorado wilderness and disappear forever. Unexpected kindness. My dear, you look like you've seen a ghost. Clara startled at the gentle voice, looking up to find a woman in her 50s approaching the parlor. She wore a practical brown dress with an apron that spoke of honest work, and her silver-streaked hair was pinned back in a no-nonsense bun. But her eyes, pale green and kind, held none of the cold assessment Clara had grown accustomed to. I'm sorry, Clara whispered, rising from her chair. I was just leaving. Nonsense, I'm Martha Henderson, and unless I'm much mistaken, you're the young lady who came in on today's train to meet our Thomas Hartwell. The woman's mouth pursed slightly. Judging by your expression, that meeting didn't go as hoped. Clara's throat constricted. Word would spread quickly in a town this size. By tomorrow, everyone would know about the rejected mail-order bride with the scarred hands and mouse-quiet voice. I need to inquire about the next train east. Sit down, child. Mrs. Henderson's tone brooked no argument, though it remained gentle. The eastbound doesn't run again until Friday, and that's 3 days hence. You'll need somewhere to stay. I'm afraid I don't have sufficient funds for... Who said anything about payment? Mrs. Henderson settled into Thomas's abandoned chair with a soft grunt. I run a boarding house 2 streets over. Clean rooms, decent meals, and no questions asked about why a person might need a temporary haven. The kindness in her voice nearly undid Clara completely. She pressed her lips together to stop their trembling. Mrs. Henderson, I couldn't impose. I'm a stranger and my circumstances are complicated. Honey, I've been taking in strays, both human and animal, for nigh on 20 years. Your circumstances can't be more complicated than half the folks who found their way to my door. She leaned forward, studying Clara's face with the shrewd assessment of someone well-versed in human nature. Besides, any woman Thomas Hartwell finds unsuitable is likely to be interesting company. Despite everything, Clara felt her lips twitch toward what might have been a smile. You don't think highly of Mr. Hartwell. I think Thomas is a man who mistakes polish for worth and noise for strength. Mrs. Henderson stood smoothing her apron. Come along, dear. Let's get you settled, and then we'll see about finding you some supper. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on her carpetbag handle. Pride warred with desperation, and desperation won. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Start by telling me your name, though I suspect it's not the meek little mouse Thomas tried to describe when he was arranging this meeting. Clara Whitmore. Well then, Clara Whitmore, let's go home. The Henderson boarding house sat on a tree-lined side street, a 2-story frame building painted cheerful yellow with white trim. A wide porch wrapped around the front, complete with rocking chairs and hanging baskets that would probably overflow with flowers come spring. It looked like the sort of place where people laughed around the dinner table and knew each other's troubles without judgment. Mrs. Henderson led Clara through the front door into a parlor that smelled of beeswax and cinnamon. Unlike the hotel's formal stuffiness, this room invited lingering overstuffed chairs with hand-crocheted doilies, bookshelves crammed with well-read volumes, and a stone fireplace with kindling already laid for the evening's fire. "I've got a room on the second floor that should suit," Mrs. Henderson said, climbing the stairs with the steady pace of someone accustomed to the climb. "Faces east, so you'll catch the morning sun. Window overlooks the garden, though there's not much to see this time of year." The room was small but spotless, with a narrow bed covered in a wedding ring quilt, a washstand with a painted basin and a braided rug that added warmth to the wooden floor. Muslin curtains hung at the single window, and someone had placed a small vase of dried wildflowers on the bedside table. "It's perfect," Clara said, and meant it. She'd had smaller rooms in worse condition, but none that felt so much like sanctuary. "Supper's at 6. Nothing fancy beef stew and biscuits tonight, but there's plenty of it." Mrs. Henderson paused at the door. "Clara, honey, whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from or toward, this is a safe place. You take whatever time you need to figure out what comes next." After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Great silent tones that shook her shoulders and left her feeling hollow, but somehow cleaner. She wept for the life she'd imagined on the train ride west, for the home she'd never had, for the cruel twist of fate that made her damaged goods no decent man could want. When the tears finally subsided, she unpacked her few belongings and changed into her one good dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, though she'd never been bold enough to believe it. At 6 o'clock sharp, she made her way downstairs to the dining room. 3 other boarders sat around a rectangular table that could have accommodated twice that number. Mrs. Henderson performed introductions with the easy efficiency of a practiced hostess. Mr. Peterson, an elderly gentleman who clerked at the general store. Miss Sally Wright, a school teacher from back east who'd come to Colorado for her health. And Dr. Patterson, the town's physician, a gruff man with kind eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent healing. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Whitmore," Dr. Patterson said, rising to help her with her chair. "Martha tells me you have come from Philadelphia." "Long journey." "Yes, sir." Clara accepted the chair gratefully, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "What brings you to our little corner of Colorado?" Miss Wright asked. She appeared to be about Clara's age, with brown hair and an open, friendly manner that suggested someone comfortable in her own skin. Clara's throat closed. How did one explain that she'd come west as a mail-order bride, only to be rejected before the ink dried on the arrangement? "Clara's taking some time to consider her options," Mrs. Henderson said smoothly, ladling stew into bowls. "Sometimes a person needs to step away from their old life before they can see what the new one might hold." The conversation moved on to safer topics. The weather plans for the upcoming Harvest Festival, speculation about whether the railroad would ever extend its line to reach Millfield. Clara contributed little, but nobody seemed to expect her to. She was content to listen, to feel part of something warm and normal for the first time in longer than she could remember. After supper, she helped Mrs. Henderson clear the table despite the older woman's protests. As they worked together in the kitchen washing dishes by lamplight, Mrs. Henderson glanced at Clara's gloved hands. "You know, dear, I've got some salve that works wonders on old injuries. Made it myself from calendula and comfrey root. If you'd like, I could—" "Thank you," Clara said quickly, "but they're quite healed. The gloves are just a habit." Mrs. Henderson nodded without pressing. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. Sometimes old wounds need tending even after they've closed." That night, Clara lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of a settling house creaking timbers, the distant hoot of an owl. Footsteps in the hallway as the other boarders prepared for sleep. For the first time in weeks, she felt something approaching peace. She had 3 days before the next train east. 3 days to figure out how to return to Philadelphia with her remaining money and what remained of her dignity. 3 days to accept that her dreams of a different life had been exactly that, dreams. But as she drifted towards sleep, Clara found herself wondering what it would be like to stay in a place where people asked no questions and offered kindness without expecting payment in return. What it would be like to belong somewhere again. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the first spark of hope she'd known in years. The man who sees Clara's second morning in Millfield dawned crisp and clear, with a kind of mountain sunshine that made everything seem possible. She woke to the sound of birds she couldn't name and the distant lowing of cattle, so different from Philadelphia's cacophony of iron wheels and shouting voices. Mrs. Henderson had left a note under her door. Gone to market. Help yourself to breakfast. No rush on decisions. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Clara found eggs, butter, and jam laid out on the sideboard with another note. For Clara, eat something proper. The simple kindness of it made her throat tight. She was sitting at the kitchen table with toast and coffee when the back door burst open, admitting a whirlwind of muddy boots, tangled hair, and urgent young voices. Mrs. Henderson, come quick. Something's wrong with Thunder. Two children stood in the doorway, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl slightly younger, both breathless with panic. They wore patched clothing and worried expressions that spoke of genuine distress. Mrs. Henderson isn't here, Clara said, gently rising from her chair. I'm Clara. What's wrong with Thunder? The children exchanged glances. He's Mr. Morrison's stallion, the boy said. The black one, he's down in the north pasture and won't get up. Jimmy Fletcher came running to town saying the horse was dying. Jimmy Fletcher. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. She forced herself to breathe. Is Mr. Morrison with his horse? Yes, miss, but he can't. The girl stopped abruptly, shooting her brother a warning look. Can't what? Other exchange of glances. Nothing, miss. It's just... Can you help? Mrs. Henderson said you might know about animals. Clara stared at them. Mrs. Henderson had said no such thing, but something in the children's desperate faces called to her. Back in Philadelphia before the fire, before the factory, she'd helped the veterinarian who tended the cart horses in their neighborhood. Dr. Brennan had taught her to recognize signs of illness and injury, to move calmly around frightened animals. I could look, she heard herself say, though I'm not a proper veterinarian. Better than nothing, the boy said. I'm Ben Miller, and this is my sister Lucy. We'll show you the way. Clara grabbed her shawl and followed the children through Millfield's back streets. They led her past the general store, the blacksmith shop, and a small white church, then out onto a dirt road that wound between pastures dotted with cattle and horses. The air smelled of grass and leather, and something wild that made her chest expand with unexpected freedom. There, Lucy pointed to a distant cluster of figures in a fenced pasture. See by the cottonwood tree. As they drew closer, Clara could make out a magnificent black stallion lying on his side, his coat dark with sweat. A man knelt beside the horse, his hands moving over the animal's neck and flank with practiced familiarity. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held his head, as if listening for something she couldn't hear. Mr. Morrison, Ben called. We brought help. The man looked up, and Clara's breath caught. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and sun-weathered features that spoke of years working outdoors. But it was his eyes that stopped, her brown as rich earth, but with a strange quality she couldn't quite identify. They seemed to look through her rather than at her. Ben, Lucy. His voice carried a slight roughness, as if he wasn't accustomed to speaking much. I told you to fetch Doc Patterson. He's out delivering Mrs. Clayton's baby, Lucy said. Won't be back till tomorrow. But we brought Miss Clara. Mrs. Henderson says she knows about animals. Those strange brown eyes fixed on Clara, and she realized what she'd been seeing. He was looking at her, but not quite seeing her. Not the way other people did. Miss Clara, he said carefully. I'm Jacob Morrison. I'm afraid Thunder here has gotten himself into some trouble. Clara approached slowly, her heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with the sick horse. What's wrong with him? Colic near as I can tell. Been down since dawn trying to roll. Won't take water. Jacob's hands never stopped their gentle movement over the stallion's neck. I've been keeping him quiet, but... Clara knelt beside the horse, pulling off her gloves without thinking. Thunder's eyes were wide with pain, his breathing shallow and rapid. She placed her hands on his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles the way he flinched from her touch. Easy, boy, she murmured, the same tone she'd used with Dr. Brennan's patients. Let me have a look. Her hands moved over the horse's body with careful precision, checking his temperature, listening to his breathing, feeling for the telltale hardness in his belly that would indicate a serious blockage. Jacob watched her work, his expression unreadable. When did he last pass manure? She asked. Yesterday evening. Nothing since. Jacob's voice held a note of surprise, as if her question had revealed more knowledge than he'd expected. Clara nodded, continuing her examination. Thunder's gums were pale, his breathing labored. Classic signs of intestinal blockage, but not necessarily fatal if treated quickly. He needs to walk, she said finally. The blockage isn't complete yet. I can feel gas moving in his belly. But we need to keep him on his feet and moving until it passes. Walk, Jacob's brow furrowed. Miss, I appreciate your concern, but Thunder weighs near on 1,200 pounds. If he doesn't want to get up, he will. Clara was already moving to the horse's head, her voice taking on a quality she hadn't heard from herself in years, confident, certain. Thunder up now. Come on, boy. She placed her hands on either side of the stallion's great head, looking directly into his pain-filled eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, Thunder began to struggle to his feet. I'll be damned, Jacob breathed. Clara helped support the horse's head as he found his balance, then immediately began walking him in slow circles around the pasture. Thunder resisted at first, but something in her calm persistence seemed to convince him to cooperate. How long? Jacob asked, falling into step beside them. Until he passes the blockage. Could be an hour, could be 6. Clara glanced at him. You don't have to stay. I can manage him. I'm not leaving my horse with a stranger, no matter how skilled she might be. But there was no offense in his tone, only a matter-of-fact protectiveness that Clara found oddly comforting. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds Thunder's labored breathing and the soft whisper of grass beneath their feet. Clara found herself stealing glances at Jacob, puzzled by the way he moved, confident and sure-footed, but with his head tilted slightly, as if relying on senses other than sight. You're wondering about my eyes, he said suddenly. Clara flushed, grateful he couldn't see her clearly enough to read her expression. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stare. Most people do. It's natural enough. Jacob's tone held no bitterness, only resignation. Took shrapnel during the war. Left me with what Doc Patterson calls progressive vision loss. Some days are better than others. Is it painful, Dusty? Not anymore. Just inconvenient. He paused. Makes it hard to read a horse's condition when I can't see the subtle signs. That's why I was so concerned about Thunder. Clara considered this as they continued their slow circuit. You were reading him with your hands, feeling for fever, checking his pulse. That's better than sight alone. You think so? I know so. I've seen veterinarians miss things because they relied too heavily on what they could see instead of what they could feel. She adjusted her grip on Thunder's halter. Your horse trusts you completely. That kind of bond doesn't come from sight, it comes from understanding. Jacob was quiet for so long that Clara worried she'd overstepped. Then he said, What did you do back east before you came here? The question she'd been dreading. Clara's step faltered slightly. I worked in a factory, and before that I helped a veterinarian sometimes. Which factory work must have been hard on your hands. Clara's breath caught. She'd forgotten she wasn't wearing gloves, forgotten that her scars were visible in the bright mountain sunlight. Instinctively, she tried to shift Thunder's lead rope to hide the worst of the damage. You don't need to hide them, Jacob said quietly. I can't see the details anyway. Only that they move with skill and gentleness. Something in his tone, matter-of-fact acceptance without pity, made Clara's throat tight. They're not pleasant to look at. I imagine they tell a story of survival, of someone who endured something difficult and came through it. Jacob's voice carried a warmth that made her pulse quicken. Scars aren't shameful, Miss Clara. They're proof of healing. For the first time in years, Clara found herself looking at her hands not as evidence of her damage, but as symbols of her strength. The thought was so foreign, so unexpected, that she had to blink back sudden tears. They walked Thunder for 2 hours before the stallion finally passed the blockage that had been causing his distress. The horse's relief was immediate and obvious. His breathing eased, his step lightened, and he began showing interest in the grass around his feet. There we are, Clara said, scratching behind Thunder's ears. Much better, isn't it, boy? Jacob's smile transformed his entire face. Miss Clara, I don't know how to thank you. Thunder means everything to me. He's the foundation of my breeding program. If I'd lost him, you wouldn't have lost him. You were doing everything right. Clara handed him the lead rope, her fingers brushing his as he took it. The brief contact sent unexpected warmth up her arm. He just needed someone to convince him to fight through the discomfort. The way someone convinced you to come help a stranger's horse? Clara considered this. The children were so worried, and I couldn't bear to see an animal suffer when I might be able to help. That's a rare gift, Jacob said seriously. Not just the knowledge, but the willingness to use it for someone you've never met. As they walked back toward town, thunder moving easily between them, Clara felt something shifting inside her chest. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she wasn't thinking about the train east or her failures in Philadelphia. Instead, she was thinking about the way Jacob's face had lit up when Thunder recovered, the way he'd spoken of her scars without judgment, the way he seemed to see something in her that she'd never seen in herself. "Miss Clara," Jacob said as they reached the edge of town, "would you? That is, I have other horses on my ranch. Some of them could benefit from your expertise if you'd be willing." "I'm only here for a few more days," Clara said, though the words felt strange in her mouth. "Well," Jacob said, "perhaps that's enough time to make a difference." As Clara watched him lead Thunder toward the livery stable, she found herself hoping 3 days might be enough for more than just helping horses. Maybe, just maybe, it might be enough to discover who she could become when someone saw her worth instead of her weaknesses. Finding her voice, word spread quickly through Millfield about the lady from back east who'd saved Jacob Morrison's prize stallion. By the time Clara returned to the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson was waiting with tea questions and what looked suspiciously like approval. "Doc Patterson stopped by," the older woman said, settling Clara into a chair by the kitchen window. "Said Jimmy Fletcher told him some woman worked a miracle with Thunder. Didn't mention you specifically, but I put two and two together." Clara accepted the tea gratefully, her hands still trembling slightly from the morning's excitement. "I just did what I could. Mr. Morrison had everything well in hand." "Jacob's a good man, Mrs." Henderson said, settling into the opposite chair. "Lost his sight gradually since the war, but he's never let it slow him down much. Runs one of the finest horse operations in the territory." He mentioned the war. "Sharpshooter in the cavalry. Took a Confederate shell fragment to the head at Cedar Creek. Lucky to be alive, luckier still to have kept as much vision as he has." Mrs. Henderson studied Clara's face with shrewd eyes. "Did you know about his condition when you went to help?" "The children mentioned he couldn't something. I didn't understand until I saw him." Clara set down her teacup. "It doesn't seem to hinder him much." "No, it doesn't, though it's made him particular about trusting people. Can't afford to rely on someone who might mislead him or treat him like an invalid." Mrs. Henderson's smile held knowing warmth. "Interesting that he asked for your help." Before Clara could respond, a knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Henderson rose with a significant look. "That'll be for you, I expect." Clara found Jacob Morrison standing on the front porch, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Up close in the afternoon light, she could see the faint scars along his temple, where the shrapnel had struck, the careful way he held his head to make the most of his remaining vision. "Miss Clara," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." Clara stepped onto the porch, suddenly aware of her appearance. She'd changed from her muddy walking dress into the blue wool, and somewhere during the afternoon she'd stopped hunching her shoulders in their habitual defensive curve. "I wanted to ask you properly about looking at my other horses. I know you said you're only here a few days, but—" Jacob paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'll pay you, of course. Whatever Doc Patterson charges for veterinary work." Clara blinked. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not a qualified veterinarian. I couldn't accept payment for—" "You saved Thunder's life. That makes you qualified enough for me." Jacob's brown eyes found hers with surprising accuracy. "I've got a mare who's been off her feed and a colt with a suspicious cough. Nothing urgent, but I'd rest easier knowing someone with your knowledge had looked them over." The rational part of Clara's mind whispered that she should decline. She had no formal training, no license to practice veterinary medicine. But another part, a part that had been silent for so long, she'd forgotten it existed, was already imagining herself working with horses, again using skills she'd thought buried forever. "I suppose I could take a look," she said carefully, "but I won't accept payment. Not until I've proven I can actually help." Jacob's smile was like sunrise. "Tomorrow morning, then, I could pick you up in the wagon around 8. I'll walk out. Mrs. Henderson can give me directions." It's near 3 miles. I don't mind the exercise. The truth was, Clara wasn't ready to be alone in a wagon with this man who seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. The attraction she felt toward him was dangerous, a distraction she couldn't afford when her future remained so uncertain. As you wish. The Morrison Ranch is north of town past the Miller place. White farmhouse with a red barn. You can't miss it. After Jacob left, Clara stood on the porch watching his tall figure disappear down the street. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside her with the silent skill of someone accustomed to observing human nature. "He's taken with you," the older woman said without preamble. Mrs. Henderson, "Oh, don't get your back up. I'm not one for matchmaking as a rule, but Jacob Morrison hasn't shown interest in a woman since he came back from the war. Never thought he would, truth be told." Clara's cheeks warmed. "I'm sure you're mistaken. He's simply grateful for my help with his horse." "Honey, I've known that man for 8 years. He doesn't ask for help from anyone ever. The fact that he's asked you to come to his ranch tells me everything I need to know." That evening at supper, Clara found herself the center of attention in a way that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't. Mr. Peterson wanted to hear every detail of Thunder's treatment. Miss Wright peppered her with questions about veterinary knowledge, and Dr. Patterson, when he finally returned from his emergency call, spent 20 minutes discussing the finer points of equine colic with an enthusiasm that suggested genuine respect for her expertise. "You should consider staying in Millfield," Dr. Patterson said over dessert. "Lord knows we could use someone with your skills. I'm getting too old to be trudging out to every ranch in the territory every time a horse goes lame." "I'm hardly qualified to replace a physician," Clara protested. "Not replace, supplement. Most of what I do with animals is basic stitching, cuts, setting bones, treating respiratory ailments. You clearly have the knowledge and the touch for it." Clara felt something flutter in her chest. The possibility of staying, of building a life around work she loved, seemed suddenly less like a dream and more like a choice she could actually make. "Besides," Miss Wright added, "we're in desperate need of a teacher. The school board's been arguing for months about finding someone suitable." The flutter died abruptly. "I couldn't possibly teach. I'm too—" Clara's voice faded to its familiar whisper. "Too what?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. "Quiet, nervous. Children need someone confident, someone who can command respect and maintain order. I'm not that person." "The Miller children seem quite taken with you," Dr. Patterson observed. "Ben and Lucy haven't stopped talking about how you knew exactly what to do with Thunder. Children have good instincts about people." Clara pushed food around her plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The idea of standing before a classroom full of children trying to project authority she'd never possessed made her stomach clench with familiar panic. Later that night, she stood at her bedroom window looking out over Millfield's quiet streets. Lamplight glowed in windows, and she could see families gathering around dinner tables, couples walking hand in hand, children playing in yards. The town looked like the kind of place where people belonged to each other, where community meant something. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine being part of it. Waking up every morning in this room, walking to work, at a job that mattered, perhaps even finding the courage to stand before a classroom and teach children to read and write and dream. The fantasy was seductive and terrifying in equal measure, because wanting something meant risking the pain of losing it, and Clara had lost enough for one lifetime. The next morning dawned gray and blustery with the scent of snow in the air. Clara dressed in her most practical clothing, the brown wool dress and sturdy boots she'd worn for factory work, and wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl. The walk to the Morrison Ranch would be tough, but she found herself looking forward to it. The road north wound through rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised winter's arrival. Clara had never seen landscapes so vast, so wild, so different from Philadelphia's cramped streets and sooty buildings. Out here she could breathe. The Morrison Ranch appeared exactly as Jacob had described, a white farmhouse with a red barn surrounded by corrals and pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see horses moving in the fields. As she approached the barn, Jacob emerged from the shadows, moving with the easy confidence of a man on familiar ground. "Miss Clara," he said, and she heard genuine pleasure in his voice. "Right on time. I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all. I was just checking on the mare. I mentioned Rosie. She's in the first stall." Clara followed him into the barn, immediately struck by how clean and well-organized everything was. The stalls were mucked, embedded with fresh straw, water buckets were full, and feed bins were neatly arranged. This was the workspace of someone who took pride in his craft. "Here she is," Jacob said, stopping before a stall that housed a pretty bay mare with intelligent eyes. "Off her feed for 3 days now. No fever that I can detect, but she's just not herself." Clara studied the mare through the stall door. Rosie stood with her head low, showing none of the alert interest a healthy horse should display when strangers approached. Her coat, while clean, lacked luster, and she'd clearly lost weight recently. "May I go in with her?" "Of course." Clara entered the stall, slowly speaking in low, soothing tones. Rosie allowed the examination without resistance, standing quietly as Clara checked her temperature, felt along her neck and belly, and looked at her gums and eyes. "Jacob," Clara said finally, "has Rosie been around any new horses recently? Or has anything changed in her routine?" "New stallion arrived 2 weeks ago from Denver." "Wyman?" Clara smiled, the first truly confident smile she'd worn since arriving in Colorado. "I think Rosie's in love." Jacob's eyebrows rose. "In love?" "She's showing all the signs of a mare in season who's fixated on a particular stallion. Loss of appetite, restlessness, lack of interest in normal activities. It's more common than people think." Clara scratched behind Rosie's ears, and the mare leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "Where is this new stallion?" "North pasture. I've been keeping him separate until I can assess his temperament." "I think you'll find Rosie's appetite returns if you move her where she can at least see him. She doesn't need to breed, just needs to know he's nearby." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed, a rich, warm sound that made Clara's heart skip. "A lovesick mare. I should have thought of that myself. It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. We see illness first because it's what we fear most." "What we fear most," Jacob repeated thoughtfully. "That's wise." They moved on to the colt with the cough, a 6-month-old with a minor respiratory infection that would clear up with rest and careful monitoring. As they worked together, Clara found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Jacob asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to her answers, and treated her knowledge with a respect that made her feel genuinely valuable. "You have a gift for this," he said as they finished examining the colt. "It's not just knowledge, though you clearly have that. It's something deeper. The animals trust you." Clara ducked her head, uncomfortable with praise but warmed by it nonetheless. "I think animals sense intention. They know when someone genuinely wants to help." "Is that what you sensed when you helped Thunder yesterday, that I genuinely wanted to help?" The question caught her off guard. Clara looked up to find Jacob watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, serious intent but not unkind. "I sensed that you loved him," she said honestly, "that he mattered to you beyond his monetary value. Animals feel that kind of love. It makes them want to fight it to get better." "And what about people?" Jacob asked quietly. "Do they sense that kind of love too?" Clara's breath caught. There was something in his tone, in the way he'd moved slightly closer, that made her pulse race and her hands tremble. I I wouldn't know." "Wouldn't you?" For a moment they stood in silence, broken only by the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls. Clara felt caught between the urge to flee and the strange desire to step closer to see what might happen if she allowed herself to trust the warmth in Jacob's voice. The moment shattered when the barn door burst open, admitting a gust of cold wind and a familiar voice that made Clara's blood freeze. "Morrison, you in here? I'm looking for that woman who's been interfering with my business." Thomas Hartwell strode into the barn like a man with righteous anger on his side. Behind him came another man Clara didn't recognize, tall, thin, with the kind of pale, predatory look that made her skin crawl. "Thomas," Jacob said calmly, though Clara noticed his hands clenched slightly. "What brings you out here?" "Looking for the woman who's been spreading lies about honest businessmen." Thomas's cold gaze found Clara armed and hardened. "There she is. Miss Clara Whitmore, the rejected bride who's been poisoning minds against decent folk." "I don't know what you mean," Clara said here, her voice dropping to its familiar whisper. "Don't you? My associate here tells me you've been spinning tales about rough treatment back east, making yourself out to be some kind of victim to gain sympathy." The thin man stepped forward with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Hello, Clara. Fancy meeting you here." Clara's world tilted sideways. The voice, the face, the predatory hunger in his expression. It was Robert Fletcher, Mrs. Fletcher's son, the man who'd put her hands into the cutting machine, the man she'd traveled 2,000 miles to escape. "You two know each other?" Thomas asked, noting Clara's obvious distress with satisfaction. "Oh, yes," Robert said, his smile widening. "Clara and I worked together back in Philadelphia. Quite closely, you might say, until she had her little accident." Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand frozen while her worst nightmare strolled into her carefully constructed new beginning and prepared to tear it down. "What accident?" Jacob asked, his voice carefully neutral, but with an undertone that suggested he was reading more in the silence than either Thomas or Robert realized. "Poor Clara had some trouble with the machinery at my mother's factory," Robert said with mock sympathy. "Terrible business. Though I always suspected there was more to it than simple clumsiness. The implication hung in the air like poison." Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, felt her carefully built confidence crumble like a house of cards. In Robert's presence, she was once again the frightened factory girl who'd been too weak to fight back, too damaged to deserve better treatment. "Is that so?" Jacob said quietly. "Indeed. And now I find her here playing at being some kind of animal doctor, taking advantage of good people's trust." Robert's eyes never left Clara's face, drinking in her obvious terror with visible pleasure. Some folks just can't seem to learn their place. Clara wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the Colorado wilderness and never face another human being. But something in Jacob's stillness, in the careful way he'd positioned himself slightly between her and her tormentors, kept her rooted to the spot. "Miss Clara," Jacob said, his voice carrying absolute calm, "would you mind checking on Rosie one more time? I think she might need another dose of that tonic we discussed." It wasn't a real request. Rosie needed no tonic, but it was an escape, a chance to collect herself, while Jacob dealt with whatever this confrontation was really about. Clara nodded gratefully and retreated to the mare's stall, though she remained close enough to hear the conversation that followed. "Gentlemen," Jacob said, and there was steel beneath the politeness now, "I'm not sure what brings you to my ranch, but Miss Clara is here at my invitation to tend my animals. She's done excellent work, and I have no complaints about her conduct or her knowledge." "You don't understand, Morrison," Thomas said. "This woman has a history. She's not what she seems." "None of us are what we seem," Jacob replied evenly. "The question is whether someone's actions in the present justify the trust we place in them. Miss Clara's actions have been nothing but helpful and honest." Clara pressed her face against Rosie's neck, drawing strength from the mare's steady warmth. Jacob was defending her. Not because he didn't know about her past, he'd seen her scars, knew something bad had happened, but because he'd chosen to judge her by who she was now, not who she'd been forced to become. "Mark my words, Morrison," Robert's voice carried a threat that made Clara's skin crawl. "That woman brings trouble wherever she goes. You'd be wise to send her packing before she causes problems for decent folks." "I'll keep that in mind," Jacob said, though his tone suggested he'd do no such thing. "Now, unless you have business related to horses, I'd appreciate it if you'd see yourselves off my property." Clara heard footsteps, angry muttering, and finally the sound of the barn door slamming shut. She remained in Rosie's stall, shaking with reaction and shame until Jacob's gentle voice called her name. "Clara, they're gone." She emerged from the stall to find Jacob waiting with an expression of infinite patience. Not pity, not disgust, not the cold calculation she'd expected. Just patience and something that might have been understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you. About Robert Fletcher, about what really happened to my hands. You have every right to what?" Jacob asked gently. "To ask me to leave. To withdraw your offer of work. To—" "Claire!" Jacob's voice stopped her rambling apology. "That man Fletcher, what did he do to you?" The question was asked so quietly, with such careful control, that Clara looked up in surprise. Jacob's brown eyes were fixed on her face with laser intensity, and she realized that his limited vision was focused entirely on reading her expression. "He, at the factory he used to," Clara swallowed hard. "His mother owned the mill where I worked. Robert was her son, and he thought that gave him certain rights with the female workers. When I finally refused his advances, He guided my hands into the cutting machine. Jacob was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet fury that made Clara's breath catch. On purpose, he called it an accident, but Clara held up her scarred hands. Yes, on purpose. And Thomas, how does he fit into this? He doesn't, not directly. But when Robert described the accident to him, he made it sound like I was to blame, like I was a troublemaker who'd brought violence on herself through improper behavior. Jacob nodded slowly. And you believe that you were to blame? The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She stared at him, seeing something in his expression she'd never encountered before, not pity, not judgment, but genuine confusion that she would accept responsibility for another person's cruelty. Of course I was to blame. If I hadn't been so, Clara, Jacob's voice was infinitely gentle but absolutely firm. What happened to you was not your fault. Not the attack, not the injury, not the fear that followed. None of it. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. The words were so simple, so definitive that for a moment she couldn't process them. No one had ever said that to her before. Not Mrs. Kowalski, not the factory supervisors, not even herself. The idea that she might be innocent, that she might be the victim rather than the cause, was so foreign that it left her speechless. But I was weak, she whispered finally. I should have fought back harder, should have. You survived, Jacob said firmly. You escaped. You made a new life for yourself. That's not weakness, Clara. That's strength. For the second time in 2 days, Clara found herself looking at familiar truths from an entirely different angle. Her scars weren't evidence of her failure, they were proof of her survival. Her quiet voice wasn't a sign of inadequacy, it was a choice she'd made to protect herself while she healed. I don't feel strong, she admitted. Strength isn't always loud, Jacob said. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep going when everything inside you wants to give up. Sometimes it's the choice to help a stranger's horse, even when you're afraid of being noticed. Sometimes it's finding the courage to trust again, after someone has given you every reason not to. Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw something that made her heart race. Jacob Morrison wasn't just defending her or showing her kindness. He was seeing her, the real her, beneath the fear and the scars and the years of believing she was broken. And what he saw, he valued. The realization was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Because if Jacob could see her worth, maybe, just maybe, she could learn to see it too, finding her voice. The crisis came 3 days later, announced by the thunder of hoofbeats and the shouts of panicked men. Clara was helping Mrs. Henderson hang laundry when Ben Miller came racing down the street on his father's mare, his face white with terror. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Clara. He pulled up short, the horse dancing beneath him. You've got to come. The wild horses, they've broken through the north fence, and they're heading straight for town. Clara dropped the sheet she'd been pinning to the line. Wild horses. The Mustang herd Mr. Morrison's had been tracking in all summer. Something spooked them, maybe a mountain lion or gunshots. They're running scared and angry, and there's near 50 of them. Ben's voice cracked with fear. Pa says they'll trample anything in their path, including the schoolhouse where the little ones are having their lessons. Mrs. Henderson paled. Where are they now? Half a mile out and coming fast. The men are trying to turn them, but the horses won't listen. They're too frightened. Ben's desperate gaze fixed on Clara. Mr. Morrison sent me to fetch you. He says you might know what to do. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. 50 wild horses in full panic could destroy half the town and kill anyone unlucky enough to be caught in their path. But what could she possibly do against such a force? Where is Mr. Morrison now? Riding ahead of the herd, trying to find the lead mare. But Miss Clara, he can't see well enough to... Ben stopped abruptly, his face flushing. Clara understood. Jacob was risking his life on horseback, using his limited vision to try to identify the herd's leader, while 50 terrified animals bore down on Millfield. The image made her sick with fear. Mrs. Henderson, get word to the school, Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Tell them to keep the children inside and away from the windows. Ben, take me to Mr. Morrison. Now. They rode double on Ben's mare, Clara clinging to the boy's waist as they raced toward the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The ground trembled beneath them, and dust rose in a great cloud that obscured the horizon. As they crested a low hill, Clara saw them, a river of horseflesh flowing across the prairie like a living tide, their eyes white with terror, their manes streaming in the wind. And there, riding parallel to the herd on Thunder's black back, was Jacob. He sat the stallion with the easy grace of a born horseman, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he leaned forward as if straining to see details his damaged eyes couldn't provide. "Jacob," Clara called as Ben urged their mare closer. Jacob turned Thunder toward them, his face grim. "Clara, thank God. I can't get close enough to identify the lead mare. Every time I try, they veer away from me." "The lead mare? Every wild herd has one, usually an older female who makes the decisions about where to go, when to run, when to stop. If we can calm her down, the others will follow. But I can't see well enough to pick her out of the herd." Clara studied the mass of moving horses, her mind racing. Among the chaos of flying manes and churning hooves, she needed to find one specific animal, the one the others looked to for guidance. "There," she said, suddenly pointing toward the front of the herd, "the gray mare with the white blaze. See how the others give her space, how they match her pace rather than passing her." Jacob squinted in the direction she indicated. "I can barely make out gray, but if you're sure—" "I'm sure." Clara's voice carried a confidence that surprised them both. "But Jacob, how do we get close enough to influence her? She's terrified, they all are." "We need to get ahead of them between the herd and the town. If I can position Thunder just right, maybe I can—" "No." The word came out sharper than Clara intended. "Jacob, you can't see well enough to navigate safely at those speeds. You could be killed. Do you have a better idea?" Clara stared at the approaching herd, her mind spinning through everything she'd learned about horse behavior, everything Dr. Brennan had taught her about reading animal psychology. Wild horses ran from what frightened them, but they also followed what they trusted. If she could somehow present herself not as a threat, but as a guide. "Yes," she said, the plan crystallizing in her mind. "But you're not going to like it." Before Jacob could protest, Clara slipped from Ben's mare and ran toward Thunder. "Help me up behind you." "Clara, what are you buying?" "Trust me." She grabbed Jacob's outstretched hand and swung up behind him, settling into the familiar position she'd learned as a child on her grandfather's farm. "I can see what you can, and you can ride better than anyone in Colorado. Together we might be able to do this." Jacob's body tensed against hers. "Do what exactly?" "Get ahead of the herd. Get close enough to the lead mare for me to—" Clara swallowed hard. "For me to sing to her." "Sing?" "Horses respond to the human voice, especially when they're frightened. Dr. Brennan taught me that melody can calm them when nothing else will. But I have to be close enough for her to hear me over the noise of the herd." Jacob was quiet for a moment, and Clara could practically feel him weighing the risks. Then Thunder surged forward and she realized he'd made his decision. "Hold tight," he said grimly. "And Clara, whatever happens, don't let go." They raced across the prairie at a speed that made Clara's eyes water and her heart lodge in her throat. Jacob rode with supernatural skill, guiding Thunder around prairie dog holes and rocky outcroppings that Clara could barely see until they were past them. Behind them, the sound of the approaching herd grew louder, a rumble like distant thunder that she could feel in her bones. "There!" Clara shouted over the wind. "Bear left! We need to get in front of the gray mare!" Jacob leaned Thunder into a sharp turn that nearly unseated Clara, despite her death grip on his waist. They were running parallel to the herd, now close enough that she could see the wild terror in the horses' eyes, close enough to feel the heat rising from their bodies. "Now," Clara called. "Cut in front of them." Thunder responded to Jacob's guidance like they were two parts of the same creature, sliding between two running horses with inches to spare. Suddenly, they were in front of the herd, running just ahead of the gray mare who led the charge toward Millfield. "Slow down gradually," Clara called. "Let her come alongside us." Jacob eased Thunder's pace, and the gray mare pulled even with them, her eyes rolling white with fear and exhaustion. Up close, Clara could see that she was older than the others, her muzzle gray with age, her breathing labored from the long run. "Easy, girl," Clara called, her voice somehow carrying over the thunder of hooves. "Easy now, you're safe." The mare's ears flicked toward the sound, and Clara felt a surge of hope. She was listening. Clara began to sing a lullaby her mother had sung to her years ago, simple and sweet and wordless. Her voice so long kept to whispers rose clear and true in the mountain air. The melody wove through the chaos of the stampede like golden thread offering peace in the midst of panic. The gray mare's pace began to slow. Her ears no longer pinned flat against her skull swiveled toward Clara's voice. Behind her, the rest of the herd began to slow as well, following their leader's example. "It's working," Jacob breathed. Clara continued singing, pouring every ounce of calm and safety she could muster into the wordless melody. Gradually and possibly, the stampede became a canter, then a trot, then finally a walk. The gray mare came to a complete stop not 50 yards from Millfield's outskirts. Her head lowered in exhaustion, her flanks heaving. The rest of the herd milled around her, no longer running, no longer panicked, but still wary and ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. "Miss Clara," Ben Miller's voice came from somewhere behind them, awed and wondering. Did you just stop a stampede by singing?" Clara looked around in amazement. Townspeople were emerging from buildings and hiding places, staring at the scene in disbelief. The school children pressed their faces against windows, their eyes wide with wonder. Even Thomas Hartwell stood in front of his bank, his mouth hanging open in shock. "I think," Clara said, her voice shaking with reaction, "I think I did." Jacob twisted in the saddle to look at him, his brown eyes bright with something that made her heart race. "Clara, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "It was terrifying," she admitted. "Brave and terrifying often go hand in hand." Jacob's smile was like sunrise. "You saved the town. You saved lives. Do you understand what that means?" Before Clara could answer, applause broke out from the gathered crowd. People were cheering, calling her name, rushing forward to congratulate her on the miracle they'd just witnessed. For a moment, Clara's old instincts kicked in the urge to hide, to deflect, to make herself small and invisible. But then she looked at Jacob's proud face, felt the solid warmth of his body against hers, and realized something had changed. She didn't want to hide anymore. She didn't want to be invisible. For the first time in her life, she wanted to be seen. "Miss Clara," Judge Patterson pushed through the crowd, his weathered face split by an enormous grin. "That was remarkable, absolutely remarkable. Where did you learn to—" "Dr. Brennan," Clara said, and was amazed that her voice carried clearly across the crowd. "The veterinarian I worked with in Philadelphia. He taught me that horses understand intention more than words. They respond to genuine care." "Well, I'd say you have more than proven your qualifications," Dr. Patterson has said. "Any woman who can stop a stampede with a lullaby is exactly the kind of person this town needs." "Hear, hear," someone called from the crowd. "Speech," called another voice. "Miss Clara, give us a speech." Clara's breath caught. Stand in front of all these people, speak publicly where everyone could hear her, judge her, find her wanting. The old fear rose in her throat like bile. But then she felt Jacob's hand cover hers where it rested on his waist, felt his strength and belief flowing through that simple touch. She looked out at the faces surrounding them. Mrs. Henderson beaming with pride, Ben and Lucy Miller grinning from ear to ear. Even some of the men who'd initially been skeptical, now looking at her with genuine respect. These people weren't waiting for her to fail. They were hoping for her to succeed. Clara slipped down from Thunder's back, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. The crowd fell silent, waiting. Clara's voice started as a whisper, then grew stronger. "I want to thank you all for welcoming me to your town. When I first arrived, I thought I was just passing through. I thought I was too damaged, too quiet, too broken to belong anywhere." She held up her scarred hands, no longer hiding them, but displaying them with something approaching pride. "These hands have been hurt, but they've also healed. They've comforted frightened animals and helped bring new life into the world. They've learned that scars don't make you weak. They prove you have survived something difficult and come through stronger." The crowd murmured approval, and Clara felt her confidence growing. "Millfield has taught me that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's loud and bold, but sometimes it's quiet persistence. Sometimes it's the willingness to help even when you're afraid. Sometimes it's finding your voice when it matters most." Clara's gaze found Jacob still mounted on Thunder, watching her with an expression of such love and pride that it took her breath away. "If you'll have me," she said, her voice ringing clear across the gathered crowd, "I'd like to stay. I'd like to help Dr. Patterson with the animals, and maybe teach your children. Because I've learned that home isn't a place you're born to. It's a place that sees your worth and helps you discover it for yourself. The cheer that went up from the crowd was deafening. Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers, neighbors who were becoming friends, children who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. For the first time in her adult life, she felt like she belonged. But through it all, her eyes kept finding Jacob. He dismounted and was standing at the edge of the crowd waiting patiently for the excitement to die down. When their eyes met across the sea of people, he smiled, a smile meant just for her, full of promises and possibilities. The crowd eventually dispersed, people returning to their daily routines with a story they'd tell for years to come. The wild horses had been gently herded back to the open range by a group of volunteer riders, the gray mare leading them with the same calm authority she'd shown in stopping the stampede. Finally, Clara and Jacob stood alone in the settling dust, thunder grazing peacefully nearby. "Clara," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion, "what you did today was necessary," she said simply. "The town was in danger. It was brave. It was brilliant. It was—" Jacob stepped closer, his hands reaching out to cup her face with infinite tenderness. "It was everything I've come to love about you." Clara's heart stopped. "Love. I love your gentle hands that can calm the wildest creature. I love your quiet voice that can sing horses to sleep and children to dreams. I love your strength that never needs to prove itself with noise or violence." Jacob's thumbs traced her cheekbones with exquisite care. "I love your scars because they're part of your story, part of what made you the remarkable woman standing before me." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. "Jacob, I love you, Clara Whitmore. Not despite your past, but because of everything it taught you about courage and compassion. Not despite your quiet nature, but because I've learned that the most beautiful music comes from the gentlest instruments." Clara reached up to cover his hands with her own scarred ones. "I love you too," she whispered, then said it again louder, claiming the words and the feeling with her whole heart. "I love you, Jacob Morrison. I love your kindness and your strength. I love how you see beauty where others see only damage. I love how you made me believe I was worth loving." Jacob's kiss was everything Clara had never dared dream of, tender and passionate, claiming and cherishing a promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "Be my wife, my partner, my heart. Help me build a life where damaged things are treasured and quiet voices are heard." "Yes," Clara said, the word emerging strong and clear. "Yes, Jacob. Yes to everything." After the wedding took place on a perfect spring morning 6 months later, with the Rocky Mountains painted purple against the sky so blue it made Clara's eyes ache with beauty. Mrs. Henderson had insisted on hosting the ceremony in her garden, which had burst into glorious bloom, roses and lilacs and peonies, creating a riot of color and fragrance that seemed to celebrate love itself. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slender frame, with her hair pinned up to show the small pearl earrings Jacob had given her as a wedding gift. But it was her hands that drew the most attention, no longer hidden beneath gloves, but adorned with a simple gold band that caught the morning light and made her scars look like silver threads woven through silk. "You're sure about this?" Mrs. Henderson asked for the third time as she adjusted Clara's veil. "Marriage is a big step, especially to a man as stubborn as Jacob Morrison." Clara smiled, watching through the window as Jacob stood beneath the rose arbor in his best suit, talking quietly with Dr. Patterson, who would be performing the ceremony. 6 months of courtship had only deepened her certainty that she'd found her perfect match, a man who valued her thoughts, celebrated her skills, and never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Clara said. The ceremony was simple but perfect. Clara walked down the garden path, not to the traditional wedding march, but to the same wordless lullaby she'd sung to calm the wild horses, a melody that had become their song, a symbol of how love could tame the wildest fears. Jacob waited for her with tears in his eyes and Thunder standing nearby, decorated with ribbons and wearing what Clara swore was a proud expression. The horse had become something of a local celebrity after his role in stopping the stampede, and it seemed only fitting that he should witness his master's happiness. "Dearly beloved," Dr. Patterson began, his gruff voice gentled by genuine affection for the couple before him. We are gathered here today to witness the painting of two souls who have found in each other what they never expected to find, a perfect complement, a safe harbor, a love that sees beauty in scars and strength in gentleness. Clara barely heard the traditional words that followed. Her attention was focused entirely on Jacob's face, on the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. When it came time for vows, they spoke words they'd written themselves. Clara, Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, 6 months ago you rode into my life on a mission of mercy, and you've been healing things ever since, my horses, my heart, my belief that love was still possible. You taught me that sight isn't about the eyes, but about the soul, and you've shown me wonders I never could have seen alone. I promise to love you not just for who you are, but for who you helped me become. I promise to be your partner in building a life where every creature, human and animal alike, is valued for their unique gifts. Clara's voice was steady and clear as she spoke her own vows. Jacob, you were the first person to see my scars and call them beautiful. You were the first to hear my whispers and know they held wisdom. You taught me that strength isn't about being loud or fearless. It's about choosing love over fear, or again and again. I promise to be your eyes when yours grow dim, your voice when words fail you, your strength when you need support. I promise to love you with the same gentleness you have shown me, and to build with you a home where healing is possible. When Dr. Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob's kiss tasted of tears and laughter and promises kept. The gathered crowd, half the town had come to see their local heroes, wet erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed was everything Clara had never dared dream of. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a feast that could have fed twice the number of guests, and the garden rang with music and laughter as couples danced on the grass and children ran between the tables with slices of wedding cake. Clara found herself swept into dance after dance, first with Jacob, then with Dr. Patterson, then with Ben Miller, who was now nearly as tall as she was, and insisted he was old enough to dance with the bride. Between dances, she was surrounded by well-wishers and neighbors who had become family. You know, Miss Wright said during a quiet moment, the school board finally voted to offer you the teaching position permanently. The children have been asking when you'll start reading them stories again. Clara smiled. She'd been substitute teaching since January, filling in when Miss Wright's health required rest. To her amazement, she discovered that her quiet voice was perfectly suited to classroom management. Children leaned in to hear her soft words, and her gentle authority had proven more effective than any amount of shouting. I'd love to accept, Clara said, though I'll need to arrange my schedule around helping Dr. Patterson with the animals. I'm sure we can work something out, Doctor, Patterson said, joining their conversation with a glass of punch in hand, especially since Jacob tells me you're planning to expand into breeding those Mustangs you helped rescue. It was true, the wild herd had become a fixture on the Morrison Ranch, with the gray mare whom Clara had named Harmony serving as the foundation for a breeding program that combined the Mustang's hardy constitution with the gentler temperament of domestic horses. It was revolutionary work that had attracted attention from as far away as Denver. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the garden, watching the celebration with a sense of wonder that never quite faded. 2 years ago, she'd been a frightened factory worker with scarred hands and a broken spirit. Now she was a wife, a teacher, a healer of animals, a respected member of a community that valued her contributions. Mrs. Morrison, Jacob's voice came from behind her, warm with amusement. That's going to take some getting used to. Clara turned to find her husband approaching with 2 glasses of lemonade and a smile that made her heart skip. I rather like the sound of it. Do you? Jacob handed her a glass and settled beside her on the garden bench. Any regrets about giving up the exciting life of a mail-order bride? Clara laughed, thinking of Thomas Hartwell, who had left town 3 months earlier after a banking scandal involving missing funds and questionable loans. Robert Fletcher had disappeared around the same time, and Clara suspected they'd fled together to avoid the consequences of their actions. None whatsoever, she said firmly. Though I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if Thomas had been a better man, if he'd been willing to overlook my scars and see my worth. You'd have been miserable, Jacob said without hesitation. You'd have spent your life trying to be someone you're not, hiding your gifts to avoid challenging his narrow view of what a wife should be. whereas you encourage me to challenge everyone's view of what's possible. That's because I fell in love with the woman who stops stampedes with lullabies and teaches children with whispers. I wouldn't change a single thing about you, Clara Morrison. Not your scars, not your quiet voice, not your gentle heart that sees worth in every damaged creature. As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder approached the garden fence, still wearing his wedding ribbons. Beside him walked Harmony, the gray mare who had become his particular favorite among the Mustang herd. The two horses nuzzled each other with obvious affection, a perfect symbol of how love could bridge any divide. "Look at that," Clara said softly. "Even they found their perfect match." "Even they," Jacob agreed, pulling her closer against his side. "It seems this ranch has become something of a haven for unlikely love stories." "Speaking of which," Clara said, settling more comfortably against her husband's warmth, "Mrs. Henderson mentioned that she's received several letters from women back east asking about opportunities in Millfield. Apparently word has spread about the town where mail-order brides aren't rejected for being imperfect." "Good," Jacob said firmly. "Maybe some of them will find what you found here, a place that sees their value instead of their flaws." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the wedding guests gradually began to take their leave. Clara and Jacob sat in comfortable silence, watching their friends and neighbors depart with promises to visit soon and continued congratulations ringing in the evening air. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Morrison?" Jacob asked when the last guest had gone and Mrs. Henderson had shooed them away from helping with the cleanup. Clara considered the question. Home, the Morrison Ranch with its white farmhouse and red barn, its pastures full of horse, and its rooms that smelled of leather and love. The place where she'd learned to trust again, to hope again, to believe in her own worth. "Yes," she said, taking Jacob's scarred hand in her own scarred ones. "I'm ready to go home." They rode back to the ranch in Jacob's wagon, Clara curled against his side while Thunder and Harmony followed behind them, with the easy gait of horses who knew they were heading toward safety and comfort. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. "Jacob," Clara said as they turned into their drive, "do you think we'll always be this happy?" "I think," Jacob said, helping her down from the wagon with infinite care, "that happiness isn't something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you choose again and again every day." "Then I choose this," Clara said, standing on tiptoe to kiss her husband beneath the star-filled Colorado sky. "I choose you, I choose us. I choose this beautiful, imperfect, perfectly wonderful life we're building together." "And I choose you," Jacob replied, sweeping her into his arms and carrying her across the threshold of their home. "Always and forever, my brave, beautiful, perfectly imperfect wife." Behind them, Thunder and Harmony settled into their pasture with contented snorts, the wedding ribbons still fluttering in their manes like prayers of gratitude. The mountains stood eternal watch over the valley, and in the distance, the lights of Millfield twinkled like earthbound stars, a reminder that home wasn't just a place, but a community of hearts that had chosen to see beauty in broken things and find strength in the gentlest voices. Clara Morrison had finally found where she belonged, and she would spend the rest of her days proving that love truly could heal any wound and make any heart whole.